America is perceived as the land of democracy, but the fruits of democracy were restricted mainly to the white American male population in the early 19th century. There was widespread discrimination on the basis of gender and race. This began to be questioned with reference to the Declaration of Independence, which was used by the white men as their Bible of progress. The black people and women used the rhetoric of the Declaration to claim suffrage and civil rights for themselves. Their argument was based on the fundamental words of the Declaration: natural rights to all. They pointed out that the American dream could never be complete without enfranchising its female and black population. The new political thought, which emerged in the early 19th century in America, was not merely an outcome of the influx of European ideas into the new land. In the 1840s, America entered into an era of prosperity. The post-independence boom brought in many economic changes which have been characterized by Professor Sen as a quantum leap.
What happened in the 1840s in the United States? There was, to begin with, a quantum leap in economic change. But there was also a huge territorial development. As you know, the westwards trek had begun. The geographical territory and the population of the United States virtually doubled in the period immediately before the 1840s. The American nation, which was envisaged as a nation of small farmers, had completely changed. Farmers, artisans, workers were now increasingly integrated into a market-dominated economy, which was moving towards industrial capitalism at a very rapid rate. Now, not all Americans welcomed these changes. Many people found that they were becoming increasingly isolated, that the connections they had with their communities, the relations that they had embedded within these communities, these were undergoing rapid transformation. As part of the way of dealing with this kind of economic change, which actually had enormous cultural ramifications, which had enormous ramifications for people's daily lives, as a way of dealing with this, women especially began to explore ways of coming together that was different and yet similar to earlier formations of community. One of the ways they did this is to form societies and associations. Now, these societies and associations were overlaid with a dominant religious movement that was happening in the United States at this time. So Transcendentalist, for instance, was one of these religious reform movements. Other than that, evangelicalism, Quaker movements, all these had an enormous impact in the way reform associations were formed. And women were major participants in these reform movements. Most of these reform associations were aimed at issues like addressing the criminal system, addressing mental health, primarily, of course, education, the absence of proper public education systems, and all that. Another very important strain, by the way, was prohibitionism, which was later to become prohibitionism, which is anti-alcohol movements, often called temperance movements in the context of the United States. So all these issues gave women foci around which they developed associative activities. Many women began to come together in small reform organizations until 1834, when the New York Female Reform Society was established, in which Lydia Finney was the president. She played a leading role. There was others, particularly Dorothea Dix, who were also concerned, along with temperance, with issues of prostitution.
Ma'am, I wanted to ask you, what was the importance of these reform organizations and the reform?
Until this point, women were relegated, restrained, constricted to the private sphere. They played enormously important roles within that. They played enormously important roles within the family economy, for instance, but they had very little public roles, except during the War of Independence, when in fact, because the men were busy at war, and you know this to be repeatedly the case, that when there is a war, men go to war and women take up the roles at home. During American War of Independence, that happened with American women also. But apart from that exception, American women were primarily tied to the hearth and the home. The reform activities from the 1840s actually gave them an entry into the public sphere. And this meant, firstly, learning the rules that govern the public sphere, learning the processes and everyday procedures of democracy, but also, most importantly, I think, a consciousness of the rights they lacked in the public sphere. It gradually awakened in them the demand for, the need for a framework of rights from within which they could participate in public life as citizens.
Women writers complemented the role played by the women in the social reform movements. Catherine Beecher and Harriet Beecher Stowe are two of the most familiar names all over the world.
The Stowe sisters began to write extensively, but they also began to address the education system at large. Women began to emerge as educators who themselves were educators, hands-on educators in that they were teachers, but also because they intervened into the education system. They began to establish schools. They began to establish the question of education for all levels, all different groups within American society. So as social reformers, as writers, as educators, women began to make a real place for themselves within the public life of the country.
Well, what was the role of the Stowe sisters? As we have heard the name of Stowe sisters in context of abolitionist movement, so in this context my question would be, what was the role of women in the abolitionist movement?
Very good question. In the United States, what was remarkable was the level to which white women, in the North especially, were part of, were actively involved in the abolitionist movement. Many of you will probably have heard of the names of many of these women. They were mostly concentrated in what we call the Midwest. And many of these women who were associated with the abolitionist movement were also gradually, because of their involvement in that politics, because of the amount of resistance within larger society to the kind of politics they espoused, they became increasingly aware of the question of their own rights. So the whole issue of white women from the North, their involvement in abolitionist movement and the evolution of the question of women's rights are absolutely inextricably linked. While the question of their own rights began to gain importance, in the abolitionist movement as a whole, there was a division between moderates who were committed to traditional stereotypical gender roles and radicals, that is among even men abolitionists there were radicals, who were willing to rethink the question of women. Within a framework of thinking about the rights of slaves, they were also willing to think about the rights of women. Now these issues came to boil in 1840 in a World Anti-Slavery Convention held in London. Many people from across the world attended this convention. 2 women from the United States went there in order to attend this convention, Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Both these women encountered a humiliating experience. They were separated from the women were separated from the main convention. They were they were made to sit in a separate place, and they were told that they could not actually participate in the proceedings of the conference. They had no voice, they could not speak. This they found to be an unacceptable proposition. Both these women, when they returned to the United States, they resolved that they would create a separate space for women to discuss not only issues of slavery, but by now what seemed to them equally important, if not even more important, was the question of their own rights. As white women, they felt that their rights were as jeopardized, as marginal, as the rights of the slaves for whom they were wishing to speak. Now, this led to a resolve to hold a women's convention.
The first Women's Rights Convention was held in the year 1848 at Wesleyan Chapel in Seneca Falls, New York. Prominent at the convention were leading reformers including Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Elizabeth Cady Stanton read the Declaration of Sentiments, a statement of grievances and demands patterned closely after the Declaration of Independence. About 300 women, including a number of black women, attended this convention. They were virtually unanimous on all issues in the Declaration of Sentiments except one, and that is the right to vote.
What Stanton had done was in the Declaration of Independence, the rhetoric was against the king, the then King of England, King George. She had replaced the word King George, the words King George, with the words all men, thereby signaling the oppression of women in the hands of all men. The implications of these was enormous because it was attacking fundamental constitutional principles on which the absence, the denial of a number of legal rights to women were based. So this was a very, very important challenge, if you like, to the way American democracy had so far been envisioned and the Constitution had so far been framed.
The convention passed 12 resolutions, 11 unanimously, designed to gain certain rights and privileges that women of the era were denied. The 9th resolution demanded the right to vote. Passed narrowly upon the insistence of Stanton, it subjected the Seneca Falls Convention to subsequent ridicule and caused many supporters of women's rights to withdraw their support.
A number of women, in fact, did not think at that stage that the right to vote was the right thing to ask on behalf of American women. Also, it is noteworthy that this convention, the Declaration of Sentiments, was ultimately signed by 100 women. The public response to this was very negative. Most of the newspapers, poured scorn, ridiculed these aspirations of women. And the fact that black women were very much an important part of this convention gave racist sentiments another peg on which to hang their disapproval, their ridicule of this convention. A lot of analysts, scholars in later years, one very famous historian, Gerda Lerner, have argued that many of these discussions, many of the demands in the Declaration of Sentiments had a religious dimension as well. And this religious dimension was a continuity from, if you remember, I said during the social reform period and the reform associations, that too had a religious tone. Now this Declaration of Sentiments was a continuity in terms of religious overtone from that period, from that rhetoric, if you like. But what was really important about the 1848 convention was that it was a quintessential moment of solidarity, of race solidarity, solidarity between black and white activists, especially black and white women. The icon of that solidarity is a woman called Sojourner Truth.
Sojourner Truth was a very important figure in the abolitionist movement and acknowledged as one of the best-known faces that brought together women's movement with the abolitionist right.
She was Isabella. Her real name was Isabella. She adopted the name Sojourner Truth at a later stage. She was born a slave in New York in about 1798. In 1826, she escaped with the help of Quaker abolitionists and became a street corner evangelist herself. She founded a shelter home for homeless women. And because she led a very peripatetic life, she never sort of settled down into a home in that sense. She called herself a traveler, a sojourner. And that is how her name comes about. And of course, she gave her surname as Truth as part of the testimony against slavery. In the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, she gave a speech. And raising herself to her full height and her voice to a pitch like rolling thunders, she asked,
"Ain't I a woman? Look at me! Look at me! Look at my arm! I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me. And ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man, when I could get it, and bear the lash as well. And ain't I a woman? I have borne 13 children and seen most of them sold off to slavery. And when I cried out with my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. And ain't I a woman?"
The speech itself was delivered in response to a male speaker who had been arguing that the refusal of votes for women was grounded in a wish to shelter women from the harsh realities of political life, i.e. a protectionist argument that women should stay away from nasty politics and stay within the confines of their protected, sheltered home. This was a very strong answer to any argument of protection. After her delivery of this speech, she became known as the Miriam of the latter Exodus. While the alliance between the women's rights activists and the abolitionists remained, they jointly undertook rallies, meetings, conventions of this sort all over the country. But when actually the Civil War began, obviously the issue of slavery dominated American politics for several years, and the issue of women's rights went into the back burner.
So far, in this episode, we have traced the course of the American abolitionist and suffragist movement until the Civil War. In the beginning, we discussed how the black people and women used the rhetoric of the Declaration to claim suffrage and civil rights for themselves. They also pointed out that the American dream could never be complete without enfranchising its female and black population. Thereafter, we learnt how the women began to form societies and associations to expedite reforms, and women writers began complementing the role played by the women in the social reform movements. And finally, we discussed how women created their own space for discussing women's rights so that they could participate in public life as free citizens. In the process, we have learnt about those who are not very prominent in the books of history, but who had equal share in shaping the American nation. In the next episode, we will continue with limitations of the American democratic system, black people and women post-Civil War period.